Hello. To mark Nakba Day 2020, the Ireland-Palestine Solidarity Campaign is honoured to host a live stream meeting with the Palestinian legal expert and political analyst, Diana Buttu. Welcome to this meeting. We hope it all goes okay, but please bear with us if it doesn't. We're new at this Zooming business, or at least I am, and I'm kind of terrified by it. First of all, a little information about the IPSC. We were set up in late 2001 by a group of human rights and community activists, academics and journalists. In partnership with Palestinians living in Ireland, the IPSC was formed to provide a voice for Palestine in Ireland. Our current chairperson is a Palestinian Irish woman called Fatin Al-Tamimi. We're an independent, non-party political organisation. We're funded by our members' annual fees, standing orders, and donations. The IPSC seeks to raise public awareness about the human rights abuses in the occupied Palestinian territories, the violations of international law, and the historical causes of the injustices to the Palestinians that lie at the heart of what we call, or some people call, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. So even though we're in lockdown, we're still trying our best to keep campaigning, to keep our campaigning work going. So we could really do with new members and donors. So if you wish to get involved, go to www.ipsc.ie/join if you want to join, or www.ipsc.ie/donate to donate. And if you're not already on our mailing list, or if you just want to get information about what we're up to, you can join at www.ipsc.ie. Now, normally we'd have real-life actions and events for Nakba Week, but obviously we can't this year. So we are doing what we can to mark it. So first of all, what is the Palestinian Nakba? Every year, coming up to May 15th, or on May 15th, Palestinians around the world mark the Nakba, or catastrophe, referring to the foundation of the State of Israel in 1948, which entailed the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the near total destruction of Palestinian society. The current far-right Israeli government, with the support of the current far-right US government under President Trump, is proposing to annex further portions of the occupied West Bank in violation of international law. So we are at yet another one of the many crises that have punctuated the history of this, if you want to call it conflict. It's actually a war against the Palestinian people. To discuss these issues this evening, we welcome Diana Buttu. Diana is a Canadian-born Palestinian lawyer and analyst, former legal advisor to the Palestine Liberation Organization, in which capacity she visited Ireland in, I think it was 2004, and a policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. She's currently based in Ramallah in the occupied Palestinian West Bank. So over to Diana Buttu. I hope. Being connected now, I think. Yes. Hello, Diana.
Hi.
Okay, let's hear you talk to us about the new Nakba, Israel's annexation plan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Thank you for hosting me to the Irish PSC, and thank you, Raymond, for serving as the moderator, and Kevin for serving as the backbone to this. I think we had a few technical problems at the beginning, but that's to be expected these days. Where we don't have technical problems is on this annexation plan, and that's what I want to spend a little bit of time speaking to you. It was a little bit of time with you today speaking about, and then open it up for as many questions as possible. Tomorrow, the new Israeli government is going to be sworn in. And the timing of this new Israeli government couldn't be more telling. It's marking 72 years since the establishment of the State of Israel, and 72 years since the ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the Nakba. With that new government that will be established tomorrow, it is going to be very similar to the previous governments that we have seen here, but with a couple of exceptions. The first and the most notable exception is that we see that Benny Gantz, once the rival to Netanyahu, is now going to be part of the government. And the second and the more important element that we see is that in this new government that is being formed, one that they are considering to be an emergency government, one of the primary pieces of legislation, one of the primary aims that this government has so far stated, is that they want to push ahead with Israel's annexation plans. And this part is very important for people to understand, because while annexation is often talked about as being a plan by the Israeli right wing, what we in fact are seeing is that this is no longer just a right wing plan. Indeed, it was a plan that was put forward by the Israeli right wing as far back as 1967. But over time and throughout the years, we've seen that gradually that it's not just the extreme right wing that has signed on to annexation, but virtually all Israeli parties, with a couple of notable exceptions. One, of course, being the Joint List, and the second being the Meretz Party. Together, they have 17 of 120 seats. What it tells you is that the rest of the members of Knesset, who are in some way representative of Israeli society, either support annexation or are indifferent to it, which is to say that they're not going to lose any sleep over it. And the reason that this is important is because throughout the election campaign, we had 3 of them here, what we saw was not that there was a critique or criticism of Israel's annexation plans, but instead we saw that candidates were falling over themselves to claim that this was an idea that they originally had. For example, we saw Naftali Bennett say that finally applaud Netanyahu for seeing the light. We saw Benny Gantz come forward and boast and say that this, in fact, had been his idea to begin with. And of course, we saw the even further right wing to Naftali Bennett come forward and say, "Well, what have you been waiting for all of this time?" In this context of people who are supporting annexation, it's important to bear in mind what annexation is really about. Now, for years, for 53 years, almost 53 years, Israel has been annexing de facto the West Bank. And what does that mean? Yes, at the beginning, when settlements were first established, there could have been an argument made that settlements were being established by, as they would put it, maverick zealots. But that has not been the case for several decades now. It's quite the opposite. Today, settlements are so part and parcel of Israel that there are bureaus within ministries that are entirely devoted to building and expanding settlements. These aren't just spot caravans in the middle of the West Bank, but cities that have been fully planned and fully thought out, with the complete intention of those cities forever remaining in Israel's hands. And over time, we've seen that the number of settlements have gone up, and of course, the number of settlers have gone up. And with that rise in number, we've also seen that there's been a shift in the Israeli mindset that these are no longer rogue elements that are building these settlements or living in these settlements, but this is an essential part of the Israeli state. And this has been the intention all along. The intention all along has always been to try to blur the green line, to try to make it so that all of this becomes one large state, and so that it becomes so that they become fully integrated into one another. And indeed, they are fully integrated. The settlements are fully integrated today. There isn't a sign as you drive into the Israeli settlement of Ariel that says you are now entering occupied territory, or when you head towards Ma'ale Adamim that says this a similar thing. Instead, it's Ma'ale Adamim is placed alongside Jerusalem. Ariel is placed along the same sign as Tel Aviv. And so it leaves you with the impression, in fact, the feeling that that you're just moving from one Israeli city to another Israeli city seamlessly, naturally, and that it is all one. And throughout the years, with this de facto annexation, what we've seen is that as Israeli settlements have become more and more integrated into Israel, we've seen that, of course, that Palestinians are paying the price. Palestinians need permits to be able to go from one area to another. Palestinians need a permit to go from the West Bank to the Gaza Strip. An Israeli doesn't need a permit to go from Tel Aviv to Ariel, but a Palestinian does. We saw that over time, the Israeli Supreme Court, a much lauded court by some, it still boggles my mind as to why it is much lauded, turned again a blind eye to the continuing settlement construction and expansion, the theft of Palestinian land, and the different sets of laws that are applied to different people. Today in the West Bank, you have two different sets of laws applied to two different people. And when that happened in Southern Africa, we called it apartheid. And when it's taking place in the West Bank, it should also be labeled apartheid. But yet, one of the problems has been that for 27 years, if not longer, but I'll focus on 27 years, the international community has myopically focused on one thing, and that is the idea of a two-state solution. You can look back to various resolutions from 1994 and compare them to resolutions in 2004 and compare them to resolutions in 2014 and compare them to resolutions in 2019. And you'll see that it's generally the same thread that is followed throughout these resolutions, which is that they want to see a revival of the peace process, depending on if there is a peace process or not, that they firmly believe in the two-state solution, and then the occasional condemnation. But while they have indicated, the international community has indicated that they so firmly believe in a two-state settlement, the international community has done absolutely nothing to make sure that that two-state settlement is actually a reality. To the contrary, any efforts to try to hold Israel accountable have been met with a great deal of resistance, including, I know, in Ireland as well, by members of the international community. And here's the irony of this. What we have seen over time is that while there have been condemnations in terms of the growing number of settlements and the growing number of settlers who are now moving into these settlements, there still isn't a recognition on the part of the international community as to how much these settlements have become integrated inside Israel. Which is to say that while they condemn the construction of the settlements and they condemn as they should, the increased numbers of and the increased incentives that are being given to Israeli settlers Israelis to move into these settlements, they have not at all focused on all of the various measures that have made sure that that these settlements are now fully integrated inside Israel. The reason that this is important is because it is doublespeak. On the one hand, they talk about how we must only focus on the occupied territories, those territories that were occupied in 1967, and yet on the other hand, have been completely ignorant and have completely decided to put their heads into the sand, to ignore just how much the settlements have become integrated into part of Israel. So when people often talk about BDS and when we push for BDS, one of the reasons that we often hear back as opposition to the growing BDS movement is that they say to us, well, you haven't distinguished between the actions that are happening inside the occupied territories and the actions that Israel is carrying out inside Israel. And yet the obvious response is they have become fully integrated. You cannot separate one from the other. And that was entirely the intent. The only people who today are still focused on the two-state settlement is the only group that is still focused on the two-state settlement is the international community. And this is why the issue of annexation is now now raising its head, and why so many people are now talking about it. Because what it does is it's the final blow, it's the death blow to all of these 27 years of negotiations, to 27 years of demanding a two-state solution, of 27 years of ignoring Israel's actions while making demands on the other hand. It's the death of all of these things combined. And so one has to ask themselves, why is it that Israel seeks to do this now? And the answer should be obvious. The answer is because it can. And the because it can is for all of these years, the Israeli right wing has been testing the waters, testing to see whether there's going to be an international response to its actions. For years, we've seen the Israeli army demolish Palestinian houses without so much as a word from many members of the international community. In fact, today you get these daily text messages of houses that are being demolished or businesses being demolished. And here we are now during the time of this coronavirus, when people are being told to shelter at home and to stay at home. How can you shelter at home when Israel has demolished your home? How is it that you are able to wash your hands for 20 seconds when Israel has made sure that you don't have access to clean water? How are these things possible? And yet they are. We've seen that over the years that in addition to demolishing homes, that the response to Israeli land theft has been complete silence for the most part. We've seen that time after time as Palestinian children are thrown into Israeli jails, that the response has been silence. We've seen that even the demolition of that even schools are slated to be demolished, and the response has been largely silence. What we've seen throughout this period of time is that the Israeli army has been continually pushing and pressing, and the response has always been silence. Instead, what we've seen is that we can hear somebody like Netanyahu utter the words that he wants to see a Palestinian entity and that he would like to resume negotiations. And these two phrases somehow become like gospel, where they cling to these two phrases and say, yes, these are the true intentions of the Israeli prime minister, while ignoring all of the actions that we have seen that have been happening on the ground for the past 5 decades. So why now? And as I said, because they can. Now we have a US president in the White House who is not only an Israeli ally, in the same way that there were other Israeli allies. Obama was a friend to Israel. President Bush was certainly a friend of Israel, and so on and so forth. This is not just a question of being an ally or a friend, but this is a president who is now actively doing Israel's bidding. And it is now that we see that the Israeli settlement movement, combined with Netanyahu, combined with all of the other segments that I mentioned earlier on, are seeing that the time is ripe to be able to do this annexation. We already got a taste of it a couple of years ago when the U.S. government illegally moved their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. We saw that there was a little bit of an uproar on the part of the international community. We lost our lives, but on the part of the international community, a little bit of an uproar, but then it died down. We also saw that a similar attack happened, similar result, when there was the declaration that the Golan Heights are going to remain as part of Israel's sovereign territory. Again, a little bit of hum, but then at the end of the day, it dies down. So if you are somebody like Netanyahu and you see that the world community is doing absolutely nothing in the face of all of these crimes, then why not proceed ahead? Why not go ahead and take more Palestinian land? Why not do it? Now, here's the question, which is what is going to happen to Palestinians, to us, in the aftermath of this? And this is the part that I think is there's going to be very little attention paid to us. Just in the same way that Israel has taken measures and actually annexed Jerusalem, leaving the people of East Jerusalem stateless and living as permanent, as what they call permanent residents, although there's nothing permanent about their status. I believe so too is going to be the case with Palestinians, but not just that. Not just that, because that is a status that is a little bit on the uncomfortable side for Israel. Instead, what I think is going to happen, I don't have a crystal ball, but what I think is going to happen is just in the same way that Israel has incentivized Israelis to move into the occupied territories, there are going to be disincentives for Palestinians to remain in that same land. I suspect that we're going to see, as we already have started seeing, the wave of demolitions happen in those areas where Israel has slated for annexation. And we will continually see and gradually see that those Palestinians will eventually move to the Palestinian parts of the West Bank that are labeled Areas A and Areas B, which you can do the math, is 40% of the West Bank. The West Bank and the Gaza Strip together are 22%, so 40% of the 22%, and you can figure out the math. Why? Because at its core, the Nakba was about taking Palestinian land and getting rid of the Palestinian people. In 1948, it was considered acceptable to do so through ethnic cleansing. Not that I approve of it. I'm sure none of you approve of it either. That's not the case in 2020. Ethnic cleansing is no longer acceptable. But what has been acceptable, and what Netanyahu knows, and those who support him, and what Israel knows, is that creating conditions whereby it makes it impossible for people to live in their homes is something that the world's community will turn a blind eye to, just as it has turned a blind eye for all of these decades. Right now, there is some talk of European countries individually or perhaps collectively doing something to hold Israel accountable. I fortunately am not holding my breath, because I know that nothing is going to come of that. But I do think that there are other measures that can be done. And I think that where the world leaders are not acting, we must. And this is why it is vitally important that we redouble our efforts to focus on BDS, that we make sure that Israel is held accountable, and that we make sure that our governments are also being held accountable, because this is going to be apartheid. It already is. It's just going to be a formal declaration of one. And unless the ultimate goal is to once again have apartheid, then the world must act. I'd like to believe that they don't want to see apartheid again. But again, I'm not going to hold my breath. So I'm going to stop here and open it up for any questions that you may have. And thank you for hosting me.
Hello. So can you see me and hear me again, I think? Thank you very much, Diana. That was not just lucid and incisive, but I think very powerful and very moving. I was particularly struck when you said that about coronavirus, telling people to stay at home. How can you do that when the Israeli army has just destroyed your home? Right, while I think Kevin is collating the questions, and I hope we'll have plenty of questions, I'll set the ball rolling by asking you a question. I'm sure you know about Senator Francis Black's Occupied Territories Bill, which calls for a ban on trade between Ireland and all occupied territories. And it has been passed by both houses of Parliament here, the Senate, the Seanad and the Dáil. But the governing Fine Gael party has said it will block it. What message would you give to the acting Irish government that we have at present?
Gosh, I've seen this for so many times and so many rounds. This has just taken shape and over so many years. Here's the logic that they have, and I'll explain that. It's actually illogical, but I'll explain the logic and then give you my response. So, the logic has always been that if we are friends to Israel, and if we coddle Israel, and if we give Israel incentives, then Israel will do the right thing. That's always the general argument. There's another argument that says this is a real life experience, which I'll tell you. This is back during the time of the negotiations, when negotiations at one point were halted, and they were halted, and the Israelis did this huge announcement of building expanding settlements, and at the time, Palestinian negotiators complained to the international community and said, "There's all of these settlements that are going up, and can you do something about it?" And I was actually in one of these meetings. One of them, the response was, No, we can't do anything now. The goal is to get us back to negotiations. And once you get back to negotiations, then you can address all of this in the negotiations. So, negotiations at one point in time resumed. And after they resumed again, there was another surge of settlements, and again, another protest. And this time the response was, Well, no, of course, we can't do anything about it now because now you're in negotiations. And so now that you're in negotiations, you're just going to have to settle this as part of the negotiations. And so this has always been the logic. The logic has been for all of these decades that the goal is to have a peace process, or the goal is to have some type of bilateral agreement, and that somehow every other nation around the world is absolved of any responsibility. And of course, this is faulty thinking. It's quite the opposite. Both the decision regarding the wall before the International Court of Justice comes out very clearly and says that other states also have a responsibility. And we know that other states have a responsibility. I don't need the International Court of Justice to say this to me either. But the problem is that no country is willing to be the one to take the first step against Israel, because they're afraid of what the ramifications are going to be, whether those ramifications are within the country or from the United States or whatever. But it doesn't make sense to me how it is that all of these countries can be saying that they support a two-state settlement while doing absolutely nothing to make sure that that two-state settlement comes into place. And that is precisely what these people are talking about. They talk about how important it is to have a two-state settlement, but are willing to do absolutely nothing to make sure that becomes a reality. The message, of course, that's being sent to Israel is that might is right, and they can do whatever it wants. And this is what led us to this place in the first place.
Back on, you are muted. Press Alt A. Good heavens.
I think you're muted now, Raymond. I can't hear you.
Unmute now. Now can you hear me? Yeah, good. With regard to the occupied territories bill, though, the thing that the government is saying here in Ireland, as far as I understand it, is that, the entire, both houses of parliament it has gone through all the stages in both houses of parliament. It's obviously a matter of public opinion as well. It's supported, but the government says it is in some way contrary to EU law. Do you have a position on that? Does it make any sense?
Of course, it doesn't make any sense. Look, when Oslo was initially signed, and then with the EU-Israel trade agreement that was signed, one of the stipulations that was contained in that association agreement is that products that are coming from the settlements are not, they can't benefit from this tax-free status that other products can. This is something that Israel signed up to, and yet all of these years there has been this constant battle where Israel says that it doesn't need to label, it doesn't need to abide by this association agreement, and the problem is that in reality, it turns out that they are correct. That because nobody wants to hold them to account, we are seeing a change in the rules and a change in the system. And this takes us back to annexation. Annexation, yes, undoubtedly affects Palestinians in a negative way. We will see that people are going to have their lands taken away from them. We will see a continuation of the apartheid regime and so on. But it doesn't just have implications for Palestine. When we talk about international law isn't just applicable to Palestine, it's applicable around the world. And by changing the rules and by allowing a bully state to get away with what it is that it wants to get away with, it just encourages other states to become bully states. So the idea that somehow they're hiding behind a set of trade laws rather than to focus, which is incorrect, rather than focus on human rights, is also incorrect. I don't see that they're taking the same position when it comes to other countries around the world. only when it comes to Israel.
Yeah. Okay, right. Apparently these other questions were here all the time. I just hadn't seen them because I'd forgotten to turn on chat. So yeah, now I have to decide. There are several questions here. This one is interesting. You said that the international community is the only force that still believes, supposedly, in the two-state solution. Yet it seems this belief is propped up by the PLO's continued clinging to the two-state solution. As a former PLO negotiator, what would be your advice to the current PLO? It's a loaded question.
No, it's a great question. It's actually a really great question. Yeah, thank you. The Palestinian Authority is wedded to wants to see Palestinian freedom. I'm not so sure that they are as wedded to the idea of the peace process, like two states achieved through negotiations, as the international community is. But I'm not going to give them a pass. Here's the problem: for as long as the Palestinian Authority has been around, and this, by the way, is one of the designs of it, it has been an authority that is subservient to another power. And that other power is either Israel or to the international donor community. What do I mean by subservient? This isn't because of the nature of occupation and the fact that Palestine doesn't control its own borders. Everything has to go through Israel. To the people who are sick and require treatment oftentimes have to be treated in an Israeli hospital. If you want to ship in anything from any country around the world, from Ireland, from China, from Japan, from anywhere around the world, it has to go through an Israeli port. And so the entire structure of the Palestinian Authority has always been one that is completely dependent on somebody else. That's the nature of occupation. Now, here's the problem with it, is that because it has been so dependent, it's never bothered to create a plan B. And this is where my anger comes in, is that it was apparent many, many, many years ago that a plan B was needed. And yet, rather than stop, take direction, take shape, and move on, the Palestinian Authority has also very much clung to the idea of the Palestinian Authority remaining in place. And so the response so far to the annexation has been much the same response that the Palestinian Authority has had for a very long time, which is to protest, but to do nothing. So, for example, the Palestinian president, who has a very deep legitimacy, who's facing a very deep legitimacy crisis because his term ended in 2009. We're now in 2020. He's more than triple the number of years that he should have been in office. What his response has been is that he's going to somehow, tear up the Oslo Accords without ever really spelling out what that means. He's never fully stated what tearing up the Oslo Accords means. And he said this, by the way, not just once, not just twice. He said it on a number of occasions in regard to a number of different things. So their response has been, and always will be, the same, which is to try to preserve whatever is left of the Palestinian Authority, because their viewpoint is that the Palestinian Authority and the survival of the Palestinian people are one and the same, and they are not. So my advice to them is that it's time for a reckoning, and it's time for a reawakening. And if this isn't a time for them to re-examine what it means to have the Palestinian Authority continue to operate in this dependent, subservient way, then I'm not sure when the time is going to be even more ripe. As it stands, we are at our weakest moment in Palestinian, weakest moment of leadership in Palestinian history, where there's been weaker moments. And yet we don't even see that there's anything new that's coming on the horizon. It's a leadership that is now very much focused on its own survival and not really taking into account the bigger picture of the survival of us as a people and the survival of our cause.
Okay, thank you for that. Here's a less controversial one, I think. Do you think that the role of social media has disrupted the ability of Israel to control the so-called narrative?
Also a great question. Yes and no. Social media is wonderful because we can do this. You know, we're all hopefully staying in our homes. I hope we're all staying safe, and yet we're all able to connect and to hear from one another and learn from one another. At the same time, there is still a role for the traditional media, and Israel both uses social media to influence traditional media and uses traditional media to influence social media. One thing that has changed over time and that I've seen is that in the past, whereas it was really difficult to be able to get the word out in terms of Israeli atrocities, that isn't the case any longer. That the only people who don't really see what's happening here in Palestine are those who choose not to see what's happening in Palestine. So social media has very much disrupted that. But at the same time, the Israeli media machine continues to have its influence and continues to influence both social media as well as government practice.
Yeah. Now, I think another important question: what role can the Joint List party play in the struggle? That's the Joint List in so-called sovereign Israel.
Right. So maybe I should give I'll give a little bit of background to what the Joint List is.
Yeah, I think so.
So following the 1948 Nakba, about 20% of the population of what became Israel is Palestinian, and these are people who remained. There were a little bit more than there were 25% then, and now roughly 20% now. And this population, 20% population, has a number of representatives in the Israeli Knesset, consisting of 4 political parties that came together as one back in 2015, and have and again in the latest election, the last 2 elections, came together as one. Together, these 4 parties combined have about 15 seats out of 120 seats in the Israeli Knesset. And the members of the Joint List are not just Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, but also Jewish Israeli citizens. There's within the Joint List. They attract voters not just from Palestinian citizens of Israel, but from people who, from Jewish Israelis who are opposed to the actions of the Israeli government. The Joint List, however, is small. It's 15 of 120, which, while it makes it one of the largest parties, because it doesn't have any other allies in the Knesset except for the other 2 members of Meretz that I mentioned, you're really only talking about 17 out of 120 members of Knesset, which means that their influence shouldn't be exaggerated, but it also shouldn't be diminished. Their role as members of the Knesset is let's say, threefold. The first is to try to block as much as possible all of the pieces of racist legislation that the government puts forward and that the other representatives of the Knesset put forward. And believe me, there are plenty of those. As it stands right now, there are, I believe it's roughly 60 laws that either directly or indirectly discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. So the Joint List works very hard to try to block a lot of that legislation. Not always successful, but at least they do their best. Their second job is to try to keep Palestinians in place and being able to survive and thrive, just in the same way that people should be able to survive and thrive around the world. So things like making sure that not only that racist legislation isn't passed, but trying to pass legislation that will positively affect Palestinian communities, and sometimes not just Palestinian communities, other communities. For example, during this, I'll take you back to the coronavirus. During the recent coronavirus, one measure that the Israeli government tried to do was they tried to pass regulations whereby pregnant women could be fired from their workplace. During the coronavirus, under the guise that this was necessary for the public. And here we had the representatives of the Joint List were the ones who ended up pushing and petitioning the court to make sure that didn't happen. So their representation isn't just in terms of Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also trying to, as I said, make people be able to survive and thrive. And their third element, which is, I think, the element that people focus a lot on, but that isn't really the bulk of their work, and that is the trying to stop the harm of the occupation. And here we know that the Joint List will do everything in its power to block annexation, that it's going to be the only party that inside the Knesset that is actively speaking against occupation. It'll be against annexation. It'll be on the front lines of pushing the international community to do something. But on their own, again, they can't do it on their own. And again, just to bring you back to the issue of coronavirus, it has been the Joint List throughout this period that has been petitioning the court to make sure that Palestinians in various places are being able to, particularly in Jerusalem, are being able to get tested for the coronavirus. So the list's role is, as I said, threefold. I don't want to exaggerate their role, and I don't want to diminish their role. I want people to understand that they're doing their part, but they can't do their part alone. This is where I think it's so vitally important for us to recognize just the extreme harm that Israel has been causing to Palestinians over these years, and for us to do our part. And I know that you are doing your part, but I just wanted to make sure that it's said again. Thank you.
Right. The next one overlaps a bit with that. It brings us back to the coronavirus again. What is the situation on the ground there with COVID-19? How has it affected day-to-day life for Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza?
This is an excellent question. You know, because Palestinians because the Palestinian Authority or the West Bank doesn't have, or Gaza doesn't have an independent healthcare system. And what do I mean by independent? We don't have the ability to bring in the necessary equipment that we need to bring in. Test kits were brought in by the World Health Organization. It wasn't as though they were being brought in by directly shipped into Palestine. Because there is no independent healthcare system, the Palestinian Authority very early on, this is way back in the beginning of March, ordered a lockdown of the entire West Bank, and in the Gaza Strip, a lockdown of the entire Gaza Strip. Now, that alone has for the most part been successful at stopping the rate of infection, at least slowing down the rate of infection. But at the same time, there have been measures where the Israeli authorities have actively undermined that. And I'll just give you a few examples. One is that we've seen throughout the month of March and April a rise in the number of demolitions, of whether it's home demolitions or whether it's demolitions of workplaces. And again, how is it that a person is supposed to be self-isolating or staying at home when they don't have a home to stay in? We saw that during the months of March and April, that the Israeli authorities didn't stop any of their raids into the West Bank. And during the month of March alone, 85 Palestinians were arrested, including 10 children, during the dead of night, with the Israeli army wearing full hazmat suits. We've seen that that when it comes to Palestinian political prisoners, that the Israeli government passed emergency regulations barring prisoners from having any outside contact, which meant that they couldn't see their families. But at the same time, they also barred any telephone communication. So we actually don't even know what the status is of many political prisoners because they've been completely cut off from the rest of the world. We have also heard of reports of Palestinian prisoners testing positive for COVID-19. And then and we don't know what's then going on in the prison system itself. And then also being released into the West Bank without ever notifying West Bank authorities, the Palestinian Authority, that these people are infected. We've seen that that the Israeli government, which previously had a system in which all workers, there's roughly 80,000 workers who work inside Israel, who used to daily have to line up to horrendous checkpoints and undergo numerous searches and wait in line for hours, that overnight they were declared essential services and able to remain inside Israel on the condition that their Israeli employers provide them with housing. And yet we've seen that the level of housing, which is not only inadequate, it's nothing that you would, I can't even, there's nothing I can compare it to say it's not even fit for human habitation. As a result, we've also seen that workers are returning back from Israel, going back into the West Bank, and also testing positive for the virus itself. So while the Palestinian Authority, and I'm somebody who's very critical of the Palestinian Authority, but while they've done a good job at locking things down in order to try to stop the spread, we've seen that the Israeli authorities have routinely undermined that through home demolitions, through arrests, through the prisoners. Another thing that they've done is that they've closed down testing centers in places such as Silwan, because the testing kits were provided by the Palestinian Authority, while at the same time the Israelis were refusing to provide testing in these areas. In short, what we have seen is that this coronavirus has really highlighted what we've been living under for 72 years, a system of racism, of discrimination, in which one group of people are deemed to have superior rights and to be worthy, and the rest of us are not.
Okay, we have time just barely for one question, and I'm afraid it's a big question as well. We've only about 2 minutes. This is Nakba week. How can the PLO reconnect with the aspirations of the refugee diaspora? And if they can't, how can Palestinian civil society?
The PLO can. It's a question of whether it chooses to. I think that the big problem has been that since 1993, with the signing of Oslo in September, of 1993, there was a shift. The focus was no longer on refugee return. It was no longer an anti-imperial struggle. It was no longer a struggle against Zionism. It became a struggle for a state. And in that struggle for a state, the people who are somehow going to come in the way of the formation of the state, that being refugees, are people that you tend to ignore. And this is very much what the PLO has done this is from my vantage point. I don't know. I haven't been to Lebanon. I haven't been to Syria. So I don't know from what's going on over there, but I'm explaining from my vantage point here. They also did the same with Palestinians who are citizens of Israel, being one of them. And so the Nakba has fallen off the radar. It's done as a symbolic measure. It's done in name only. The right of return is only ever mentioned as a slogan, but not much more beyond that. I don't see that there has ever been an active push, not only to demand refugee return, but to support those protests where people are themselves demanding refugee return, such as the Great Return March that has been taking place in Gaza now for 2 years, where people are demanding that they have their right to return. So although the PLO can, I just don't think that they will, because there's a lack of will there. And civil society is, I believe, connecting and continues to connect with and connect on the issue of Nakba. In fact, this is the reason I'm here today, and this is why we see so many of these Nakba activities happening around the world. Our voices need to become louder and stronger, and I believe now that we're seeing the final death to the two-state solution, to this fictitious two-state solution, that we can start talking about the real issue. And the real issue is the ethnic cleansing of Palestine that happened in 1948. And by getting rid of the noise of the two-state solution, we can actually start talking about the future. The future is where people are not only treated with equality and dignity, but also able to return to their homes. I'll just end with a very personal story. My father is a Nakba survivor. He was 9 years old at the time that the Nakba happened. But he wasn't just a person who survived the Nakba. He describes it in very vivid details about what it was like to see the army come in and take over his city, and for him to flee. He was also internally displaced and remains internally displaced, and so he's now 81 years old, internally displaced. And every time that we pass Nazareth, which is the town that he ended up being raised in, to go to Haifa, which is the city in which I live, he always passes by his land. And even as a citizen of the state of Israel, is still not entitled to go back to his land, even though we see it every single time that we make the drive from Nazareth to Haifa. He sees exactly where his relatives were buried. He sees exactly where his house was. He sees exactly where his school was. And yet he's never been able to go back. I think that our future has to start focusing on people like my father, and so that they don't have to live these another 72 years of trauma. And instead we can start talking about dignity for all.
Thank you. I've been asked finally to ask you, is there a ray of hope?
There always is. Of course. Of course there is. No, I'm serious. As long as we are breathing, we're resisting. Let me put it differently. If I were to look around in Palestine, I can't say the world, but Palestine, and think about the places that, one of the places that's perhaps externally the saddest, it's the Gaza Strip. 2 million people locked in. If you're a child who is 11 years old, or 12 years old, you've lived through 3 wars, through 3 brutal wars. 95% of the water is not drinkable. The UN has said that the place is going to be unlivable, and it already is unlivable. It's subjected to endless closure. It has a collapsing healthcare system. The Israeli army is shooting at young protesters, like the way that you would shoot at fish in a bowl, if you would ever shoot at fish in a bowl. 53% unemployment, completely blocked in. And yet, if you've ever spent any time in the Gaza Strip, you'll know that it is one of the most exceptional places on the face of the earth, because no matter what Israel does, we have a desire to live and we have a zest for life. And no matter what Israel does, that's one thing that they cannot take from us. They can take away a lot of things, but they cannot take away our desire to live in freedom. So for as long as we are breathing, and as long as we are able to resist, we will. And that, for me, leaves me with hope. It's when we throw in the towel and say that there's nothing worth, that this is the whole thing is over, that's where I think I and others will be depressed. But so long as we are able to, there will always be, for me at least, there will always be hope.
Diana Buttu, under occupation and lockdown in Ramallah, thank you so much for talking to us this evening.
My pleasure. Thank you, Anna.
Okay. So I have a few seconds, I think, just now to wrap things up on this side. We are asking people to post Nakba Day selfies this Friday on all social media platforms using 2 hashtags. First one is #Nakba72 and the other #Key2Justice. For more information on that, see again www.ipsc.ie, where you can also become a member and support us financially. Finally, we would encourage you to approach your political representatives, and particularly Fianna Fáil and Green TDs, with regard to the Occupied Territories Bill. Details www.ipsc.ie. And ask them to support this bill and to make sure that it gets passed, because that is one way in which this tiny little country can punch above its weight, to use a cliche, by setting an example that I'm sure other countries in the European Union would follow. So www.ipsc.ie, or follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, or YouTube. And thank you for being with us this evening.